welcome to Science Friday.
Here's some for E as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
So this can be, like, in the case of this paper, gyrification or brain folds.
A neuroscientist started to look at the brain
as like the
more as an
incredibly negative
area.
Am I good on the mic? Okay, wow, that's loud. I just want to start off by saying, who here has ADHD? Okay. So, first of all, here's a disclaimer. Don't make medical decisions based on this. You should probably go to an actual doctor if you have questions or anything, because that's not me. And then also, one thing about like the language that I use, this study, and I am also going to be using terms like normalization, and I'm not trying to imply that a non-neurotypical brain is bad in any way, but in this specific context, you know, I can function and focus better when my brain is normal. So I want to start off by saying, what's wrong with this ad? Like in the medical context and how we look at drugs. Unless you don't get audio. That's a problem. It's basically just one of those pharmaceutical ads, but one of the prevalent problems in it is that it doesn't actually go into like why drugs work, how drugs work, and it doesn't really have many effects about that. So by doing a lot of doing research like studies like this, we can actually see why these drugs work and how they work, which means we can make better decisions about that. And related to that, it helps us in developing new drugs for specific treatments. So here's a really quick little bit about ADHD's influence on my life. I was diagnosed in preschool because I was like very annoying and hyperactive and had all those traits. And then they gave me Ritalin and I was like, this is it. I can focus now. This is awesome. So I saw the immediate effect, and although my medication has changed since then, it's still really important to me that I become medicated because like even if I just forget for a day, I'm so hyper-focused on something or not focused at all that I can't even come to school. I feel like one common misconception I have about ADHD is that it's not like, medication isn't magical. For me, my medication usually wears off at like 2:30, depending on a few different conditions, meaning that during my last class, it's a lot harder than all my other classes because I have to really strive to pay attention and not just like get lost in something, I don't know. So here's a little bit about the two most common drugs to treat ADHD, Adderall and Ritalin. So Ritalin is methylphenidates, and these stimulants work by increasing the release of dopamine and norepinephrine in the frontostriatal circuitry. That's a little bit complex, but basically those two hormones, I think, dopamine and norepinephrine, they cause activation in certain brain regions, and by stimulating that activation, it can normalize it. So the main points of the study are A, defining impulsiveness, and then they use timing dysfunction as a proxy for impulsiveness in ADHD. And then they also look at the brain regions that show different levels of activation in ADHD versus the controls. And to sum it up, the effects of Ritalin on ADHD. So here's a question for you guys. How would you define impulsiveness? Talk for like 30 seconds or something. Okay, that's enough time. Anybody got an answer? Anybody want to raise their hand? Guys, what do you think how would you define impulsiveness? It can be any definition. Peter.
I would define impulsiveness as kind of
like as soon as you have an idea to do something, you're driven to do that, and there's nothing your brain can do itself.
Yeah. Anybody else have an idea or something they want to add on? Micah?
Kind of like a scale of how you're like, kind of two ideas that are you like ideas in general of what you need to do or could do or want to do, and then you have your instantaneous like reflex. Oh, I want to grab that cookie and eat it. Example, and it's like the ratio between how strong the two of those are in your brain.
Okay, so this study defined impulsiveness as a poorly controlled, inappropriately timed, premature, and immediate response style. What this kind of means is that you execute actions without considering all the available information and also considering consequences. Like the kid in the last picture didn't really consider that his parents might be angry at him or something if he takes the cookie. So that's how this study defines impulsiveness, and they're going to continue to use that definition for measuring it. So here's a quick intro about the patients and controls. So both patients and controls had 10 boys, ages 11 to 16 or 17 in controls. And in the patients, they had a clinical diagnosis of ADHD and were recruited through parents or clinics. They excluded neurological abnormalities like epilepsy and substance abuse and other major psychiatric disorders because they didn't want other things like interfering with ADHD. They just wanted only ADHD. And then something to keep in mind is also only 4 of the patients were medication naive, meaning they had never taken this Ritalin before, whereas the other 6 were taken off 36 hours prior so it wouldn't interfere with the results. Where the controls were, they basically didn't score very high and below the cutoff on like the hyperactivity score or the SDQ, and they were recruited through advertisements. So here's a little bit about impulsivity and delayed rewards. Subjects chose between a smaller amount of money immediately and a larger amount after 1 week, 1 month, or 1 year. They used 10 euros because it was European for now, and then $100 or euros later. And what this looks like is this in visual representation. So they calculated a reward with a function that depends on the amount, the delay, and an impulsiveness indicator K. Larger K values associated with greater reward devaluation. And that kind of means like the longer delay that you have in time between when you get the reward, that's like how you subjectively devalue it because it takes more time. So it's like, I'm not gonna wait that long. So they found that larger K was positively correlated with higher hyperactivity score. And then greater reaction time was also correlated for delayed choices compared to immediate choices and controls. And what this looks like graphically is the control mean, which is the average hyperactivity or impulsiveness indicator, was pretty low for the controls in red, and it's pretty high for ADHD. What's also consistent across both graphs, where one is like reaction time and one is just K value, is the standard deviation for ADHD skyrockets, and that's because impulsive and it's not consistent. They don't consistently have like an impulsiveness. It kind of just occurs at different times. So you can also see the standard for reaction times. They had such a small reaction time, or fast, like they made a choice without thinking it through. So let's get into the actual results because this is an fMRI study. But before that, a few more definitions and then we can go there, I promise. So temporal foresight is the ability to consider future consequences of immediate action. So in the cookie example, if I take the cookie, my parent's gonna yell at me and I'm gonna have to sit in a corner for an hour. Temporal discounting, that is a measurement of the degree to which a reward is discounted in relation to its delay in time. So in ADHD, this kind of takes place because people with ADHD are biased to think that even though it's a larger reward, if it takes place in a year, they subjectively see it as less valuable than the immediate reward. For temporal discrimination, that's just the ability to determine that 2 sequential stimuli are separated in time. And this is what that looks like for patients in ADHD. Here are some key brain regions. The basal ganglia is like this little mid part here. The cingulate gyrus is that highlighted purple section, and the anterior part is here. The cerebellum is this weird purple ball of yarn down here, where the primary motor cortex, is here in yellow, with the supplementary motor cortex here in blue. The parietal lobe is up here, and the inferior parietal lobe is the part that this study looks at, as well as the prefrontal cortex right here. That's what also the study looks at. And then here's our what's responsible for timing function. So the prefrontal and parietal cortices, they are responsible for like perceptual timing and temporal foresight for longer periods of time, while the basal ganglia is like responsible for sustained attention. The cerebellum is responsible for event timing and temporal prediction, while kind of both the SMA and ACG are responsible for motor timing and perception of time, like also estimating how long something will take. And in the three things with red, these are what's seen in underactivation in ADHD in the next figure. So this is an MRI scan, and this is the red and yellow is where contrast happens, which basically means they overlaid brain scans of ADHD and controls, and that's where there were differences in brain activation. So in figure B, you can see temporal discrimination of only a few like milliseconds, and you show that there's a little bit of reduced activation in ADHD patients, because this basically shows that there's more activation in controls in these areas, but it's not very substantial. The numbers also represent just the different layers of the MRI. Where in figure C, which is temporal discounting of a week, month, and year, you see a huge amount of difference in activation. And this again corresponds to reduced activation in ADHD. So the time discrimination task that they used is the block design discrimination task. And that's like in each block of time, a pair of different colored circles were presented to the people in the MRI machine with differing times between when they were presented on the left and right. And the subjects just had to decide which one was presented for longer, or which one was presented second. So here's some important figures. So in all of these subjects, activation was observed in the dorsolateral and inferior prefrontal cortices, the ACG and SMA, and then these two areas, which I didn't really talk much about. But in figure A, this is what 12 healthy controls, not compared to anything, look like during the time discrimination task. So this is when they're presenting the circles to them. And that just shows normal activation. So this is what your brain will probably look like if you don't have ADHD and you're doing the same task. Whereas in 12 patients under placebo, meaning they weren't actually given a real medicine, and this is kind of like fake, so it's just them with ADHD, unless there's placebo bias in it. And it shows a lot of different areas being activated at different depths too, because you see there's a lot less depth where a lot of these are activated. That's at like more the surface, whereas this is at there's not much activation near the surface here. And for 12 patients under MPH, the results look strangely similar to the 12 healthy controls. And MPH, again, is Ritalin, the drug. So that's one comparison, and that's pretty important because that means that it achieves a good amount of normalization. The next figure is where stuff really gets going, because in these two are under placebo conditions, and in figure 1, or I, it's areas where the control brain has increased activity compared to the ADHD brain. So this is where the ADHD is underactivated. Whereas in II, that's areas where the ADHD brain had more activation. And this is under, again, the placebo medication. So that showed like over there. But B is like probably the most important figure. If there's anything you should remember, it's this, because this shows that under the medication, patients compared to controls where red and yellow would mean any different activation, there is no difference. They're functionally similar. So what that means is that the study was the first MRI study that really demonstrates Ritalin activating regions in the inferior prefrontal cortex, which is not usually as active in ADHD patients, and that is responsible for a large amount of timing. And again, this study kind of defined impulsiveness as a poorly timed response style. So by measuring all these like timing areas, they're able to say that because people with ADHD are more inclined to react at different times and inconsistent times, that's why they're more impulsive. One thing to consider is that this doesn't really encompass all aspects of ADHD, because a lot of it is lack of focus and other stuff that isn't really included just by impulsiveness. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing the study showed is that after giving somebody with ADHD Ritalin, all abnormal brain activations were normalized. This study also affirms and builds up onto the association that many studies have talked about between ADHD and timing's relation to the dopaminergic neurotransmission abnormalities. And that's just what I talked about at the beginning. That's how dopamine and norepinephrine that causes increased production of those, causes increased activation in those brain regions, which normalizes timing. So what Ritalin is doing is just causing the increased production of norepinephrine and dopamine. This study really points to timing dysfunction in these brain regions, leading to increased impulsive behavior in people with ADHD. That's pretty much it. As I said before, the one thing that's really important to remember is this right here, because this just shows that all of the abnormal timing function is normalized. And that means that just shows that, I think with really substantial proof that this medication works, and although it doesn't really take into account downsides, which there are a few, like there was an ad, in all the ads where they're like blah, 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 speaking at 1,000,000 miles per hour. So that's one thing to consider, but other than that, that's where I leave you guys.